to the Bible Feed podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Welcome everybody to the Bible Feed podcast. I'm Laurence Davenport. I'm here with Dan Weatherall to talk about the final session looking at Matthew, so discovering Jesus in Matthew. Welcome once again, Dan.
Hi, Laurence. It's been emotional, hasn't it? We're here and then on the last session.
Yeah, it's been lots of weeping.
Gnashing of teeth.
So we've done a lot, we've been through a lot, and some of the high points, as it might be, in the summary of what we've been looking at. We started, didn't we, looking at that genealogy. We saw that Jesus was expected to be the King of the Jews, and we saw that link, didn't we, with David and Abraham and the dream of Joseph early on. We saw that reference to the kingdom of heaven as well in that passage linked to his temptations. And what was the kingdom of heaven all about? And we noticed that wasn't going off to heaven. It was more about heaven's rule on earth. So that link to the heavenlies that we saw, didn't we, in the letters as well. So things related to heaven's rule on earth, which is really interesting and maybe for some people a new way of looking at those passages. We've also seen that Jesus is a sign that God is with his people as well. So we looked at that a little bit last session when we were looking at some of the titles that we see in Matthew of Jesus. So Son of Man, Son of God, the Christ. And also the fact that the gospel message has been opened from open to Jew and Gentile. And we even see that in the genealogy, don't we? We see Rahab and we see Ruth, Gentiles who are linked with the process of Jesus is coming to be. We see the way he dealt with those temptations as well, which is really interesting, the way that he turns away from his own thoughts and his own temptations. And we saw that the devil, as referred to in that passage, was really a way of describing his own thoughts and the temptations that he had. And he turned away from those things and kept his mind on the things of God and the way that he knew that God wanted things to be outworked, which is really interesting again, because that gives us a bit of an understanding of what the devil is. And then we see the relationship between God and man and that kind of hierarchy of God giving Jesus the authority to do things. And again, this links back to last week's episode where we see Son of Man and Son of God and that relationship. So we have covered a lot of stuff over the last few sessions. And you hinted at the end of the last session that we were going to start to look towards the end of Jesus' life and a bit about his death and a bit about his resurrection. But you give us a bit more detail on that, will you, Dan?
Yeah, so that's obviously where everything's heading, isn't it? And probably the most famous thing about Jesus is that he was crucified. And that's what we're going to just think about extremely briefly. It's in one short episode, so we're just going to pick out one thing and then think about the fact he was raised from the dead as well. That's the claim in Matthew in the Gospels. That's what makes this that's what made Christianity start and kick itself off. If the resurrection wasn't there, then we wouldn't be talking about it. So yeah, just think a little bit about that.
Okay, great. So we did start looking at some of the passages towards the end of Matthew, and we had a look at a passage from the trial last session. But where are we going to start today? Where are we going to base ourselves?
Yeah, so what happens after the trial then is he's condemned. He goes before Pilate as well, and Pilate condemns him, even though Pilate doesn't want to condemn him. And all these things that happen, Jesus is therefore condemned to death and he's publicly crucified. But during that, he remember the claim was that he's King of the Jews. That's Matthew's claim, that he actually is King of the Jews. But all throughout his crucifixion, there's this sort of mocking irony going on. You know, he has the crown of thorns on his head, doesn't he? He has the sign up saying he is the King of the Jews. They sort of mockingly bow down to him, and all these sort of terrible things. But it's sort of this is all driving the point that he is the one claimed to be the King of Israel, and yet he's going through this now. So the question is he? We thought thought about that last time. Is he the Son of God? Is he the Christ? Is he the Anointed? Is he the Messiah? And this is the challenge to that, isn't it? His death. Does that mean it's failed? Does that mean he isn't those things? So that's what happens sort of next. And then we get to Matthew 27 and verse 45. There's just a few verses here that talk about something that Jesus says from the cross. And I think that we can use that as a bit of a springboard. So Matthew 27 verse 45 to 50.
Do you want me to read those? Okay, so Matthew 27:45. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, This man is calling Elijah. One of them at once ran and took a sponge filled with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit.
Yeah, there we go. So that's actually the moment of his death. So not long before that, Matthew records him saying these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? So the other Gospels, as I'm sure you'll know, Laurence, they describe Jesus as saying different things from the cross, don't they? Well, Mark has the same one here as Matthew, but then there's other sayings from the cross. There's no reason I know of that why Jesus couldn't have said them all, and the Gospels are presenting a different emphasis on, as we've seen. So let's try and think about what Matthew might be doing in presenting this saying.
Yeah, and these words. I mean, this passage, it's really emotional, isn't it? It's really poignant. And kind of brings, I think, a very the personal feelings of Jesus at this very point, this real pivotal moment of his death. And he has this phrase, doesn't he? My God, why have you forsaken me? And that's a real kind of gut-wrenching statement, isn't it, from Jesus?
Sure.
And I understand that's pretty much a lifted quote from Psalm 22, isn't it? Like the beginning of Psalm 22. Why is that significant? Well,
we're going to go look at that in a moment. Just before we do, this phrase, or the fact that Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me, has sort of given rise to so many different interpretations and different ideas. And it's probably, I think, a spin-off of how you understand Jesus and what you think he is, that then drives how you sort of interpret what's happening on the cross. And therefore, part of that is how you understand this phrase. So it's almost like a little case study here for thinking about our understanding of Jesus and what that therefore impacts on how you then understand what happens, through his death. So there's things like God was so appalled by the sin in the world, and the sin of the world was put on Christ, so he forsook Christ on the cross. That's one view, that's one interpretation. Or God's wrath came on Jesus, and he felt that wrath when he was bearing the sin. He's punished. He's effectively being punished for the sin of the world, and so he's crying out, "Why have you forsaken me?" Slightly different sort of approach is that, well, maybe God's Spirit has left Jesus, and he felt that, and therefore he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So he's left alone. I mean, all these things, they're not in the text, are they? They're kind of driven by the assumptions of who you think Jesus might be. If you think he, is God himself, or whatever you think, that sort of drives how you sort of interpret this passage. There's it's a famous Stuart Townend hymn, "How Deep the Father's Love for Us," which I'll say right now, I think it's really, really lovely, and it's a really moving hymn. I'll happily sing along with it because of how I understand it. But there's this phrase, isn't there, in one of the verses that says, "The Father turned his face away," which kind of understands that, he pretty much was forsaken. That, God the Father turned his face away from the Son, so that he could suffer that sort of wrath and that, suffer that forsaking moment. And it's how if you're sort of seeing that Jesus is God coming to sort of pay the debt of the sins, then this kind of has to happen. He has to be turned away from God, has to turn himself away from Jesus, because that's kind of what you're expecting. But we're going to explore it, because you've already raised Psalm 22, which I think we should explore, because the question is, well, did God forsake Jesus? Did the Father turn his face away? And I think, in one sense, I think the answer is going to be that Jesus definitely felt like that. You've already said that, haven't you? About he's human, he's this raw emotion, he's feeling the effects of it. But actually, we find it at no point in this at all God had turned his face away, in the sense of he hadn't actually forsaken him at all. So in that sense, maybe that line in that hymn could misconstrue things a bit. But
Yeah.
as I say, it's still a beautiful hymn. So
I mean, the very fact that you have a pretty lengthy psalm which starts with those words gives us a huge amount of context to work on and to understand what was in Jesus' mind when he said those things, because,
definitely,
it's lifted straight from that first verse.
There's even more we need to do before we go back. Sorry, to Psalm 22.
Right.
So just before, I promise we'll get there.
I want to get to Psalm 22, Dan.
Psalm 22, come on. Okay, I'll be quick.
Get me there.
So Jesus has just experienced the following things. Okay, let's just put these in our heads. The disciples have fled. They've left him. Okay, so they've forsaken him. That's pretty clear. He's just seen and heard Peter, who had sort of followed in, but he's denied Jesus, denied that he knew Jesus. So Jesus has just experienced that. So Peter's forsaken him. The crowd who, when Jesus arrived into Jerusalem earlier that week, they were calling for him to be the king, installed as king there and then. The crowd have basically chanted for him to be crucified, so they've forsaken him, okay? Pilate, okay, the governor, Pilate, who didn't want Jesus to be crucified, has just washed his hands publicly in front of all the people and the priests as a symbol to basically say, look, I'm innocent of this man's blood. I've nothing to do with me. If you want to crucify him, you're his blood on you, effectively. But so Pilate's forsaken him as well. He's the one that could have stopped this, but he's just washed his hands of it and gone off. The chief priests and the scribes, well, they were never rallying around him ever, and they were mocking him. The soldiers are mocking him. The people who passed by, it takes the time to say, verse 39, those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. Verse 43, the chief priests and elders say, he trusts in God, let God deliver him now if he desires him, for he said, I am the Son of God. So, all these people have forsaken him. And then the robbers, verse 44, the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. So he literally is forsaken by everyone around him.
That's very reminiscent of the actions of the leaders in the Good Samaritan as well, isn't it? That's a theme that comes out.
Yeah,
forsaking and ignoring, and just walking past and wagging their heads, not getting involved.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So then think about this. Jesus cries out, "My God, why have you forsaken him?" But we get given the Aramaic call, that Jesus says, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," however it's pronounced. I have no idea. But basically, you get this curious incident, verse 47, that some of the people there said, he's calling for Elijah. Perhaps Elijah's going to save him. Verse 49, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Wait, see what's going to happen, and nothing. Elijah doesn't save him. And I think that's the point of that. The point of this is that, nothing, everyone has forsaken him. Nothing is happening. Nothing is saving him. And therefore he is utterly feeling forsaken and feeling abandonment. I think that's the core here, the core meaning here, that Jesus is absolutely experiencing this. And we talked last time, didn't we, about him being a human, being a man, just like us. And he's the Messiah, he's the Son of God, but he's a person, and he's feeling tragic abandonment. And the fact that he is human, he is a son of man, really accentuates that, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose one other abandonment you could add to the list is Judas as well. Prior to the fact, you've got Judas, and you have a link there again with the Psalms about mine own familiar friend, and you've got a familiar friend, which is somebody who they resorted together, they spoke together in the Mount of Olives many times, and turned away from him, abandoned him, forsook him.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So okay, let's think about the Psalms. Let's think about Psalm 22 now.
Yes, please, Dan. Because can we go to Psalm 22 now?
As you've pointed out a few times, this is pretty much an echo of Psalm 22. So, Psalm 22 verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Okay, so it's Jesus here quoting, or I think probably more likely sort of expressing the emotions of this psalm, and whether or not it's actually consciously, but he's truly feeling this. and he's feeling being forsaken. But this then is a key, isn't it, to help us understand what's going on in the narrative of the crucifixion, because it's not only that quote that links, is it? There's all these other little quotes. So let's just sort of zip through some of this. So verse 7, all who see me mock me. They make mouths at me, they wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord, let him deliver him, let him rescue him, for he delights in him. That's basically exactly what Matthew is recording. So Matthew's deliberately writing this gospel narrative, knowing about Psalm 22 and knowing what Jesus says, and is making sure that the reader is hearing Psalm 22 in the background. And because these things happened, and he can see that this is all there beforehand in Psalm 22. And verse 11, be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. That's what happened? None to help. They all forsook him. They all went away. So the challenge is, God, are you far from me? Be not far from me. Be near to me. Why have you forsaken me? Why are you far off? That's the cry. And then so that's challenging the core statement in chapter 1 that Jesus is the sign, Emmanuel, that God is with his people. Well, is he? Is he? This is a serious challenge to that because of what's happening. He's the Messiah, and yet he's being killed.
Well, also, the disciples felt that themselves, didn't they? They felt it immediately before, and Jesus said to them, you will be offended in me, and this is going to happen. And remember, there was the disciples walking on the road away from Jerusalem, and they didn't know what had gone on. So they felt they felt they didn't understand what was gone on, and has this plan failed?
Yeah. You're straying into Luke there, Luke's gospel, but that's fine. Yeah, you're absolutely right, because it kind of the gospels converge a little bit. Certainly, Matthew, Mark, and Luke converge at the crucifixion, and all the narratives and the presentation up to that point sort of then come to the fore. And this is the thing that happened to this man, Jesus, who we've been talking about, and we didn't understand it at the time, but we realise now that this was here in Psalm 22, and it shook us because we thought he was the Messiah who would be king in this way. But actually, this is what happened. That's what's happening. That's to explain what's going on in the death. Jesus is acting out and actually putting. He's acting where his mouth was. He's said all these things about the Sermon on the Mount, about loving neighbour as yourself and turning the other cheek and all that sort of thing. And he's now doing it in the absolute, most ultimate sense. He couldn't do anything else more to act out those principles.
So he was the opposite of being a hypocrite. He was actually performing the instructions that he'd been giving others. He was showing that in his own life.
Yeah. So and that therefore is how the kingdom should be lived. It's self-giving, and this becomes his enthronement. This becomes, they're mocking him as King of the Jews, and yet he is the King of the Jews, and he's demonstrating it that he's the Messiah by acting in this way, because ultimately people are going to realise this, and then they're going to be moved so much by feelings of guilt of their own behaviour, feelings and feelings of amazement that Jesus could act out of such love and self-giving, and that will move them to try and follow him and become people of the kingdom as well. That's what's happening, which is remarkable. It's wonderful. So there's more in Psalm 22. So verse 6: dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. So that's how the ESV renders it here. That I know that they've pierced my hands and feet. That sounds absolutely crucifixion language, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And if that's what the text says, that's explicit connection. There are some variants there if the original is something a bit different. So that might not be a specific connection. But then the very next couple of verses, verse 17, I can count all my bones, they stare and gloat over me, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So Matthew quotes that in chapter 27.
I mean that's hugely specific, isn't it, as well? A really specific quote there. And also Matthew, you get the occurrence of that it might be fulfilled. So Matthew is leading you to these passages and linking it, isn't he?
Yeah.
With the fact that Jesus is the person who has been spoken about in the prophets and here in the Psalms. So it's really he doesn't mince his words. He gets to the direct linkage between these passages in Matthew and the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Okay, so that's Psalm 22. That's the desperate situation it's in, and it comes up again in verse 19. Do not be far off. O you, my help, come quickly to my aid. So the psalmist is in a pretty bad state. It points forward to Jesus, who's in a very bad state, and that's what Matthew's trying to draw your attention to.
Yeah, and I suppose if Jesus has got this passage in his mind, a bit like the temptations. When he was being tempted, he countered that with linking back to Scripture, and here he is in a dire straits as well, and he obviously feels these emotions, but he's also thinking about this psalm as well, all the things that have happened here. It can't be far from his mind, really, because it's so obvious that it's looking towards Jesus. And the comfort it starts to come in towards the end of this psalm, doesn't it? So it doesn't end with all of these terrible things. It actually starts to get a lot better towards the end of the psalm, and a lot more positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so this then becomes the key for answering the question, has God forsaken Jesus? Is that really what was going on in the cross? And clearly it isn't. God hasn't actually forsaken this person, because verse 22, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. Verse 24, he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. So, that's pretty clear. So God actually hasn't hidden his face. Verse 27 says, this is the result. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. So we're thinking about, is Jesus the king? Is he the Messiah? Is he the Son of God, the Son of David? And it looks like he isn't, because he's being killed. But actually, this psalm says, yes, he is, because this is going to end up with people bowing down and worshipping and recognizing the kingship of God, the sovereignty of God, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. People will recognize that, and they'll realize that God hadn't hidden his face. So that's how the psalm ends. It ends with the Messiah is established as king despite all the terrible things that he's gone through, because that is part of how he gets there, rather than standing on the mountain when he's tempted to take it all as himself. He's had to go through all this.
But the quote is a question, isn't it? Have you forsaken me? ? And so the answer to that is towards the end of this chapter. All these bad things have happened, and yet you've not forsaken me. That's the kind of answer comes towards the end there. And I suppose that's leading us, isn't it, towards what would then come in Matthew, which is then an amazing turnabout. He's talking about the resurrection, and you don't have much. There's not much content on the resurrection here at the end of Matthew, but it goes straight from the death, his burial, and then straight into the resurrection. Just almost a handful of verses really in chapter 28.
Yeah, so compared to Luke, like you said, referred to, it has all that story about them walking down the road and meeting Jesus and not realizing who it was. There isn't an awful lot, but what Matthew does record, so verse 5, an angel speaks to the women who came to the tomb. They say, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus. Sorry, this is Matthew 28, verse 5. I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. And they say, go into Galilee. And verse 9, behold, Jesus met them and said, greetings. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And that's what Psalm 22 said, didn't it? It said about people are going to worship because they'll sort of realise that God hadn't forsaken. God was with his people. And it even comes up verse 16. So this is right at the end now of this gospel. This is like the summary. Everything is culminating to this. Verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. But some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And he talks about going and making disciples. So there again, they worshipped him, and is the reference to the authority that has been given to him as a consequence of everything that he is doing and has gone through. And ultimately he was showing that authority beforehand, hasn't he? But through his death and resurrection, all authority is given me. He's achieved it, and he is now both Lord and Christ, to quote Acts. He's confirmed that. God has confirmed it.
It's interesting that the emphasis that Matthew has here, but also you've highlighted around this worshipping. We do see it elsewhere. We see it when he was in the ship for that second time, I think, when they do proclaim him as being the Son of God and they worship him. But here specifically, it's emphasized a number of times. And, you might think there's connotations there that come from this worshipping. What does that imply about Jesus? The fact that these people are taking hold of his feet and worshipping him?
Well, you get it earlier on in the Gospel as well, in chapter 2, when the wise men come. Mm-hmm. So we talked about them a couple of times before, haven't we? And they want to worship Jesus as well. So Matthew 2 verse 2, they say, "Where is he who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." There we go. I was just checking to make sure it did say that. So they want to come and worship him because he's King of the Jews. So I think that's really helpful, because that shows this isn't worship as in worship to a deity, to a god. This is honouring and showing obeisance and bowing down to someone who's superior, i.e. the king of the Jews. And actually they realise that the King of the Jews is King of the world, because he's God's, or the one true God's anointed king, who is who's God of all the world. So therefore his king is going to be King of all the world. That's the point in Matthew, isn't it? That the King of the Jews is the king for the whole world. So I think that sets the stage for what worship really means. Psalm 22 talked about worship of God and recognising the kingship of the rule of God, and that's then fulfilled by the people who are worshipping Jesus. So the question, like you say, and people do draw conclusions from that and say therefore, absolutely therefore, Jesus must be God, because it says in Psalm 22 they'll worship God, and then they worship, or they bow down to Jesus. But they're bowing down to him and giving glory to God. There's a really excellent verse. So we're going to dive out of Matthew again and just look at Philippians chapter 2, because this basically summarises what we've said, summarises everything in such a brilliant way. And again, it's useful, isn't it, to concentrate in one book, so concentrate in Matthew and then try and sort of dive out to other parts of Scripture just to verify what we're looking at. So Philippians 2 and verse 8, talking about Jesus, it says, "Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." There's a thing about Jesus, his death. He humbled himself even to that point of death, which is what we've seen. He felt forsaken. He experienced all those things. And therefore God's exalted him. He's given him a name, like he gave him authority. So it's not a name that was intrinsic to him. He's given him exalted status. And then every person in heaven and earth and under the earth should bow to him, effectively, should worship him, in the sense of bowing to a superior, to the king. But all of that is to the glory of God. So you can see how by worshipping, or by bowing down to and serving Jesus as our Lord and as our Master and as our King, by doing that, it is worshipping God, because he's God's agent, he's God's representative, he's God's King, an anointed one. So I think that passage there really helps to clarify that, and just show that we haven't got some sort of strange anomaly going on in Matthew. Everything is coming together and presenting the same story. We've seen consistently all the way forward, haven't we, about this is the Messiah, the King, the Son of God, the Anointed. And so there isn't some strange blip at the end. This is absolutely showing this, and Jesus is the one who has that authority, and the disciples realise it and bow down and worship.
It's a nice bookend to Matthew, where you've got all authority in heaven and earth being given to me in verse 18, and that's kind of how we started that establishment of authority, didn't we, early in Matthew? You've got this, he was given this authority, but it wasn't necessarily recognised by everybody, and people were asking, how has he got this authority, where's it come from? And what we're seeing at the end of Matthew is actually, yes, people are going to recognise the fact that he is being given this authority, and therefore he should be worshipped. And so it's almost like a righting of the situation, and people accepting him and people worshipping him.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's kind of Matthew completed, in a sense. Check, tick that off. But just to sort of think about it all in one holistic way, if we can sort of summarise it into a paragraph or short few sentences, we've seen, the point of him going through that feeling of being forsaken or being abandoned is is all tied up with the way the kingdom comes, isn't it? Like him denying temptation to sort of take it on his own terms. Instead, it was giving his life. It was living out those things of the Sermon on the Mount and all the other teaching that he gave, that he actually lived by his words and was self-giving and felt the consequences of that, the dreadful suffering, the dreadful sort of agony and feelings of abandonment. And that's the total opposite of the people who were trying to bring the kingdom to themselves in their own way through violence or through extreme piety and purity at the expense of other people in the society and things like that. It's very, very different. But this is the kingdom that he was proclaiming. It's the kingdom that he, is bringing. And it's something ultimately, when we thought about the kingdom, it's something ultimately that's going to sort of come to final fulfillment in the future, isn't it? But people who follow him now ought to be part of that kingdom in the sense that they ought to live by that teaching right now. So looking at what Jesus did on the cross, looking what he went through, is like that model, that template, and the motivation to give our lives and to follow him in as best we can in different ways in our lives.
Thanks, Dan, for taking us through these different sessions on Matthew. And I know it's been very useful for me to spend this time with you, not only highlighting some of these themes and links that we see through Matthew and trying to emphasize this, the role of Jesus, but also the fact that it's really practical as well. There's so much practical advice. We can read this and think about the amazing work of Jesus, but also we can look at this and go, yeah, I can lift my eyes to things heavenly. I can approach temptations in my life in the way that Jesus did, trying to be not self-centered but God-centered. I can look to the Sermon on the Mount and I can take that little package of practical ways of living your life. So thank you very much for the time that you put together, Dan, in pulling all of these sessions together.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm sure maybe at some point we'll have a follow-up session or two.
Good. Yeah, no, I'm sure we'll revisit Matthew at some time.
Final things, please come and visit our website, biblefeed.org, and also join the conversation on Facebook and Instagram, which is Bible Feed Online, I believe that's the tag. Give us feedback, give us a review. If you've got any thoughts or questions on the content that we've put forward in this podcast or any of our other podcasts on this series, please let us know. We'd really look forward to having a dialogue with you on the amazing content of the Gospel of Matthew. So
thank you
and goodbye.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think, hear your questions or subjects you'd like to discuss. So get in touch with us through our Facebook page or send us a message on our website at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.